I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Cara, and we are so glad to be back today. We are excited because we get to have Dr. Connie Befus back with us as a guest. She will be sharing with us about the topic of good mourning.
Wait a minute, it's not even mourning.
Well, mourning meaning grief.
Oh, that kind of mourning.
Yes, so it's really how important the grief process is and how we can work through that. So Connie Befus is a psychologist with 35 years of experience in providing for the mental and spiritual health needs of cross-cultural workers. She grew up in Africa as a TCK, and then she and her husband served in Latin America for 17 years. She's done private practice as a psychologist. She has worked as a consultant for missions organizations and a director of member care for a sending organization for 17 years. She has 2 adult third culture kids, and in her doctoral research, she explored effective helps for people in the midst of cross-cultural adjustments. And she recently authored a book called Sojourner's Workbook, A Guide to Thriving Cross-Culturally, which we talked about quite a bit in our last podcast with hers.
Well, certainly just listening to Connie's bio there, she's well equipped to address the needs and concerns of those working cross-culturally and for those who are loving, praying, and supporting those people.
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about her work and with missionaries, specifically in the first term, you can go back and listen to our podcast on that topic. And today we are looking forward to learning more about good mourning.
Okay.
So, Connie, we're so glad you're back here on our Innkeepers podcast. And today we're going to be talking about good mourning, as in grieving. Can you share with us a little bit about your story and how you came to want to better understand and teach about grief and mourning and loss in the cross-cultural context?
Sure. I grew up in Africa as a missionary kid, third culture kid. And then after meeting my husband in college, we went overseas as young adults, as missionaries as well. And I became gradually more fascinated with human psychological processes in general, and especially how people adapted or didn't adapt through cross-cultural adjustment. And I wanted to understand why some did fairly well and others did not do well, and how to help them. So I got a master's degree in counseling. And then eventually I still didn't know enough, so I got a PhD in counseling psych. I did some private practice in the US and on the field, and then got involved in full-time member care. And a theme that kept popping up over and over and over again that I needed to deal with in my own life and that other people did was loss. How pervasive it is and how unhelpful it is when people don't know how to grieve or mourn and don't feel like they have permission to do so.
Yes, I would definitely echo that statement that the loss and the grief is so prevalent in the cross-cultural life.
Yeah.
What is it, do you think? I mean, we're obviously, this is going to be the bulk of our conversation today, but as you were talking with people and people are making the cross-cultural transition, what kinds of things were consistently coming up in conversations related to grief and loss?
Well, in my own life, I learned that I hit a point in my 30s where I felt like I was not very joyful. And I thought, why not? And I started reading everything I could on joy. If you've ever gone through Cruden's Concordance, there's like 3 pages of references in the Bible on joy. And I studied all of those and secular authors. And I realized that the back door into joy is doing your grieving for the losses that you have. And that if you're going to keep the losses tamped down and unrecognized, then you're going to miss out on the full range of emotions. So I learned that for myself and then started learning to ask people, and especially if they would come in presenting with depression. And it wasn't clear what it was caused by, or maybe it wasn't a typical depression. I would say, just tell me about your last 3 years. And then as they would recount for me, I would point out that, do you realize this is a loss? That's a loss. This is a loss. That's a loss. And they'd go like, oh, no wonder I feel kind of dragged down and sad. And then it was the process of helping them learn how to grieve.
So would you say a death is necessary to be grieving in the way you're talking about?
The death of a loved one or somebody important in our lives is a loss that most people recognize. And nowadays also, if people lose, like a house in a hurricane, or they're fired or something like that, there is more recognition that those are losses. But there are so many life losses that people don't recognize. The loss of a dream, the loss of a reputation, a betrayal, not being able to have children, relocations, those all are losses that people, depending on what they mean to them, those losses, they need to grieve them.
Yeah, I've thought about this concept in that, we expect loss to be like the separating this huge thing, like you were talking the death or the hurricane or things like that demolished all our belongings. But these smaller, perhaps sometimes seemingly insignificant loss can be like a million little paper cuts, and they're painful.
Yes, and they add up. They're cumulative.
Yeah, and I think when you find yourself in a cross-cultural context and you realize, oh, it's a holiday and I'm not at home and I'm not doing the things that I typically do with my family or with my friends at this holiday, or I can't even celebrate because of the context I'm living in. I can't even celebrate like I normally would. And those, it seems like, oh, that's insignificant and minor, but it's not. It has to be recognized and named.
It is not insignificant. How many guys, bless their hearts, miss the Super Bowl?
Yeah.
And they miss, getting to watch that with whoever, their family or their friends, or, and they feel like somehow they shouldn't grieve, that loss, that it's too silly. So we do that to ourselves. Yeah.
We moved to Eastern Europe just before Christmas in 1995. And our oldest son commented at the time, he's like, he commented on the fact there were no Christmas lights. There was nothing to say, hey, it's Christmas season. You don't drive around the neighborhood and look at lights, because no one did Christmas lights. And it's just something that he mentioned. And it's like, I probably didn't take the time to acknowledge that as significantly as I could have.
If not a loss, at least something that he missed.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think in today's world, many of our overseas servants don't realize they need to mourn the proximity of family, because we stay in touch through the internet, through Zoom, through Skype, through FaceTime, whatever. Not recognizing really that that's not the same. That's not like being able to go home for Thanksgiving and hug your family and see them face to face and smell the familiar smells and laugh with them. Or even just to be able to get together with your sister once in a while, give her a hug, laugh together. You can laugh over the internet, but it's not quite the same.
Yeah, so all these smaller things and bigger things, sometimes trauma that people are experiencing can also bring about those feelings of loss.
Yeah.
How do you know if you're experiencing perhaps unresolved grief?
Well, people get depressed, they get irritable, they get draggy. It's those feelings that indicate something is not well, something is not right in my psychic world. And so those of us who have worked with this learn to look at that. Is there a sadness there? Is there something that I'm missing? Another cue for some people is that they seem particularly emotionally labile, like they'll cry at the drop of the hat over something that doesn't seem like a very important loss. And it could be that that is a more important loss than they realize. But what is more likely is that they have an accumulation of 3 or 4 or 5 losses that they didn't really realize and haven't taken the time to reflect upon and mourn over.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about how people grieve? Because we don't all grieve the same, but there's probably some pattern to grief. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Technically, if you look up the difference of, as I just did, grieving and mourning on Google, they will say that grief is the feelings that we have, and mourning is what we do externally to acknowledge the grief. And that's helpful to a degree. But I think that we can do some proactive thinking and reflecting about what the loss is that will help us. And nobody may see that. That might be something that we do completely on our own and privately. Was that your question? What was your question?
Yeah, just the differences between grief and mourning, and then kind of is there tend to be a pattern to the grieving process?
And you asked, are people different? Yes. And some people actually do cry. They weep tears.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Many of us don't. And the absence of tears does not necessarily indicate that someone isn't grieving and isn't in a healthy process of doing mourning. So some people need to kind of boo-hoo-hoo all over the place and sob and have people hear them, and other people want to withdraw and be very private, and that's okay. And sometimes when we know that a loss is coming up, like we know the loved one is going to die because they've been placed in hospice care or they're in a coma, some of us start grieving right away, almost in an anticipatory way. Others will do it the day the person dies. Others won't get around to it till 2 months later. Or let's say a missionary family is going overseas and they've got 2 parents and 3 kids. 1 or 2 of them will start doing their grieving before, while they're packing the suitcases and selling the house and doing everything. Some people will cry the day they get on the plane. Some will do it a couple of months later, and some will do all 3. We're very different in how we handle those things. And particularly as we live together in a family or in teams, we need to make allowances for the fact that our grieving styles can be very different, and that's okay.
Yeah, I've definitely had those conversations with guests here, helping them see that different family members are all grieving differently the same loss of transitioning from one country to another. And it's sometimes surprising for them to realize, oh wait, like you not talking and hiding in your room is grieving, and me crying all the time is grieving. Like that's both grief. So yeah, I think it does take in some awareness to change the conversation.
Yeah.
So what do you think is unique to the cross-cultural experience, specifically for MKs or third culture kids and grief?
Well, let me take the first part of that question first, because missionaries can experience any of the kinds of loss that people who stay in their home culture do. Loss of loved ones, loss of job, house, your dog dies, any of that. But then because they transition so much and they're leaving their family and their church and so on and going to a foreign culture, and then because they have that uncomfortable stage of cross-cultural adjustment where they're not fluent, they don't understand the culture, and so they feel inept and stupid, and they maybe don't think of it, but it's a loss of a sense of competence. And for a while, there's even almost a loss of an identity. Nobody knows that I was this, famous, well-loved youth pastor. Here, all they know is that I bumble around and I can't even figure out how to get the shopping done for my family. So who am I anyway? So there are those losses that missionaries go through in mid-missionary life. Then they miss, family events. You maybe miss a wedding or a funeral or the death of a loved one or a big church event or something that happens in your community or even in your country. There were people overseas during 9/11 who felt that as a loss simply because they weren't with their community when they went through that experience. So there are all those kinds of losses. So I think there's just more loss in general in missionary life, which is why it's so important for them to need to know how to deal with it. And then if we come to the third culture kid, the MK, it's slightly different because their concept of home is usually different than their parents. If their parents came from the US of A, they grew up there and they went to Timbuktu, then they miss things from home. Their kids, if they grow up in Timbuktu, have a totally different concept of home. And they're often quite confused about where home is and what they miss. So often for third culture kids, home is where their parents are until they create a home of their own. And they can miss things from both cultures. They can miss things that their parents miss, like maybe Thanksgiving with grandma. They can also miss the sights and smells and foods and activities from Timbuktu where they grew up. So they can have a lot of loss in their lives.
Yeah. And it can be complicated, like missing things that can't be replicated. I mean, I'm just thinking my own experience of, so we did Thanksgiving in Brazil, but it was not an American Thanksgiving and it wasn't Brazilian Thanksgiving because they don't have Thanksgiving.
Right.
So, but that experience of Thanksgiving can't be replicated in my life now. So it's kind of this complex, weird, like, what is Thanksgiving, So there are all of those kinds of losses that I think MK specifically experienced, of very unique experiences as well that probably will never be replicated in the same way because there's like this perfect odd mingling of experiences, cross-cultural experiences. Does that make sense?
Well, it does to me because I am a third culture kid, and it's hard for us to explain ourselves because home can be a lot of different places and we can miss any one of them and also miss a permanent sense of belonging to anywhere.
Yes.
And it's possible that some third culture kids and MK, not all of them, because our experience, as you know, is not the same.
Yes.
But for some of us, the learning to grieve a loss of any permanent belonging anywhere might be something we have to reflect upon.
So grief and mourning, it's should be part. I mean, the grief is the part of our lives, the learning to mourn well. So can we talk a little bit about some of the things that would help us to be good mourners, quote unquote?
Yes. I think first of all, feeling or having permission to recognize those losses. And I think I tell the story of how once when we were living in Honduras, somebody brought me a jar of raspberry jam, which doesn't seem very significant, but I loved raspberry jam. And a guest came and ate gobs of it, and I was so angry at that guest. Now, is that small a thing something that we grieve over? Well, I didn't cry, but I realized that it represented for me something cherished from my home country. And I think that those kinds of things are clues, that we need to notice when we miss something, or we get to have it for a short period of time, and that's very special. And then be aware that most of us need some solitude, some time for quiet reflection. Some of us are external processors, and so we need a good friend. who will just listen without judgment and without criticism, and let us say, this is what I miss, and it just hurts right now. And I didn't know it would bother me so much. And here's why it bothers me, and I just miss it. And just name it and accept it. And if it's a slightly larger loss, like it's a person that we're really missing, or it's a position that we loved, something dear to our hearts, then we probably will have to do that more than one time. It will come up again with that lump in the throat, or that kind of catch in our breath or something. And we're like, oh yeah, I'm missing that again. Some of us get moved to tears, but it's just, it's a signal that we need to kind of go off by ourselves. However we do that, take a walk, sit in our rocking chair with a cup of coffee, and just kind of think, okay. And because we get to belong to the Lord, and because many of these things, I think when we miss something, it's something he has asked us to miss. And we can offer it to him and say, Lord, this hurts. I know that you are not mad at me because it hurts. Thank you. But it does hurt. And I lift it to you. I know you're not going to replace it right now. So I acknowledge that it hurts. And I think the sting goes away a little bit then. It's not that we stop missing the thing. It is still a loss. But then we have much lower tendency to be bitter about it.
Yeah, as you're talking, I think about how that permission, you're giving yourself permission to grieve.
Yes.
And I think sometimes it's helpful if someone else gives you permission to grieve. I know in my life, I have a pretty powerful story of being at MK transition seminar, and it was a session teaching on helping us understand these things about naming the losses and recognizing losses. And at the end of the session, the speaker said, I give you permission to grieve. And one gal started crying, and then another one. And it was just like this collective mourning that happened.
Yes. Yeah. Because you finally had permission. Yes.
And it is a vivid memory for me of how powerful that permission is.
Yes.
So maybe for a parent to say to their kid, it's okay that you miss fill in the blank.
Yes.
I give you permission to grieve.
Yeah.
What power and what a gift that would be for a parent to say that to a child, instead of saying, you shouldn't feel bad about that. God called us here, whatever. And not being able to hold that emotion and that loss. Yeah.
Our parents, my parents' generation was not as well schooled in this kind of thing as we are today. But I remember when I was going to be left in the States because my parents were going back to Africa, and overhearing a conversation between my mother and my little brother. And he said, Mommy, do you ever cry? This is to my mother. She said, yes. She said, when I think about leaving Connie behind, I cry. And that was beautiful for me because she didn't say it with any shame. She just acknowledged that she was going to miss me, and that she cried over it. And it just gave me permission to do the same thing. I encourage missions in their pre-field training to have a course on this, on Good Mourning. The candidates who have not yet gone to the mission field often don't really understand what we're talking about, but that's okay. They've heard it, and many of them have come to me, 5-7 years later and said, I kept my notes from that workshop, and when I got there, then I knew I could grieve, and I knew how to do it. So yeah.
You're equipping them, giving them the tools they'll need later.
Giving them permission in advance. Yes. You are going to need to feel these losses. They're going to, it's interesting, isn't it? We say to the Lord, I will go. I know that I need to take up my cross and follow Jesus where you have called me. And we are ready. We are as ready as we know how to be in that moment to accept those sacrifices. And then we get there and we gradually find out one small thing at a time how much it does cost.
Mhm.
And we kind of feel like, well, we said we would do this, so it's not supposed to hurt this much. But it does.
Yeah.
And so to give permission that you don't want to stay stuck there, but to acknowledge that it costs and that it hurts and that you miss this thing that you are missing is part of your calling. Grieving, mourning well is part of our calling because it allows us to move on from there. People who don't grieve the losses they have then don't have, to use a very crude and simple metaphor, they don't have as much psychic space, if that makes any sense, because the unmourned losses are taking up space in their emotions. So then they don't have room for the happiness that's there in the new culture, for meeting new people, which they need to do if they want to be effective in a new culture. So grieving the losses that we experience is part of what we need to do so that we can be effective where we've been called.
Let's just go a little further with that thought and talk about some of the things that stand in our way of grieving and mourning.
Well, one that we've been talking about is not having permission.
Yeah.
I think another one is an inappropriate, inaccurate concept of spirituality, that if we were really spiritual, we wouldn't need to mourn these things. And I think sometimes speaking as a missionary for a moment, our constituents, whether they're our supporters from our churches or our family, or the people that we go to, have this erroneous concept that because we stepped up and said, yes, I will do this, we therefore get given special powers not to feel the losses.
Yes.
And that is so not true.
Like
we are going to feel them. What?
Like we're super spiritual all of a sudden.
Yeah. And it sounds silly if you say it out loud, but I think we kind of expect that of ourselves. That if I was really right with the Lord and I really was spiritual, then I wouldn't feel this loss as much as I do. And that is simply not true. We're just human. So we feel the loss. And the correct thing to do with it is recognize the loss, name it, reflect upon it, cry if we need to, and then do it over again in 2 weeks, if that's what we need to do.
And you did mention one thing earlier when you talked about sometimes we can minimize people's feelings of loss by the things we say to them. Could you talk about that just a little bit more?
Well, there are two parts to that. Sometimes what is a loss to somebody else wouldn't be to me.
Right.
And so I need to be careful how I speak to them. And as adults, we can do that to children. Some parents getting ready to go to the field might feel like their little son Johnny is really going to miss his friend, and he is going to miss his friend. But what he's lamenting is, the Nintendo that he's not going to have for a while. And the parents would think, well, that's very materialistic, but that's his loss. Yeah. We don't get to say what's really a loss for somebody else. Right. We just need to acknowledge it and let them grieve it. And then I had a thought. What was your question again, Steve?
Just how to be careful not to minimize someone else's loss through the things that we say.
Thank you. Yes. In the Christian world, there's a great tendency to spiritualize it and to say, yes, but all things work together for good. So the Lord is going to work good out of this loss. And that's a tough one because the Lord is going to do that. But in the moments of feeling the impact of that loss, that simply is not helpful to the person. And they probably believe it in the best way they can. What they need is from Romans 12, grieve with those who grieve. Yeah. Which doesn't say anything about lecturing or preaching. by the way.
I've been more aware recently of trying to police my when I to not say don't feel that way, stop feeling that way, or I mean those don't and stop are kind of
Mhm.
me imposing my feeling on someone else about that,
Yeah.
and not there's a lot more appropriate ways to have those conversations than reprimanding someone by my words.
Yeah. And applying that to TCKs is very helpful because as parents, we it's natural to want to stop crying. It's not a pleasant sound. We're geared to stop it, to feed them, change their diaper, whatever it is, that they need. But as third culture kids and MKs grow up, paradoxically, that's the opposite of what we need to do. One of the hardest things I've ever done is sit at my 8-year-old daughter's bedside because we were moving and she was anticipating her grief at leaving her friends. And I wanted to say, it will be okay. And ultimately, a year later, it was okay. But I bit my tongue because that is so not helpful. I wanted, I was experiencing as a parent the pain of her crying and tears,
Mm-hmm.
which were due to a decision on the part of her father and I,
Uh-huh.
right? So that's how we feel as parents. I caused this loss.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I don't want you to feel bad about it because you're making me feel bad. um, we're complicated, right?
Right.
But the correct thing to do was to sit there and let her cry in a sympathetic way and say, I understand. The one helpful thing I think we as caregivers, parents, and teachers of TCKs, instead of saying it will be okay, which we don't know and doesn't help them in that moment, we can gently say, one time when I was a little older than you and I felt like you did, and we moved, and I felt like I was never going to have a friend again. But after a couple of months, the Lord gave me a friend, and I did have one. So you're giving hope from your own experience instead of giving this blanket, it's going to be okay.
So you touched on this a tiny bit about how we sometimes over spiritualize and maybe have a misperception of what scripture teaches about grief. But let's answer it instead in the positive. What does scripture speak about grief and loss, and what are some biblical examples perhaps that you could share with us today?
The Bible overall, Genesis to Revelations, has an awful lot to say about feelings in general and grief in particular. It's quite amazing. In the Old Testament, I find it interesting that you'll have people like King David mourning the loss of his son Absalom. You have Hannah with infertility, and others expressing grief. And there is not a breath of criticism of them, ever. What God's people are criticized for in the Old Testament is idolatry, but not expressing feelings. And in the New Testament, it's interesting. Paul expresses quite a bit of distress at different times. And of course, Jesus is our prime example. I like to share 4 different scriptures in which Jesus really grieves. One of them is in Matthew. I think it's 18. Jesus is informed that John the Baptist has been beheaded and killed.
Yeah.
I find it very instructive that Jesus gets in a boat and goes away.
Mm.
It does not say that he went off to grieve, but I think that's what he went to do. In Luke 19, in the passage that we call the triumphal entry, that has to do with Palm Sunday, Jesus is coming down the path on the donkey, and the crowd is making all this noise, yelling, Hosanna. And Jesus stops and looks over Jerusalem, and he weeps. And I think, it is over a failed ministry, which many of us know what that is like. Now, Jesus did not fail in any way. The Bible says he accomplished the will of his Father. He was always obedient. But people did not listen to him or respond to him in the way that he hoped. And he wept very openly. For his disciples to notice and record that, it must have not been quiet because there was a lot of noise. And then in John chapter 11, with the story of Lazarus and Jesus' dear friends, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, it's so interesting because Jesus, if you read the passage carefully, he purposely let Lazarus die.
Yeah.
And then he came and he spoke individually with Mary and Martha, and he wept. Now, Jesus knew that within a half an hour, maybe less, within 15 minutes or so, he was going to call Lazarus back from the dead. So he was not weeping for Lazarus, I don't think. I think he was weeping out of empathy at what death does to us. And there's a very strong Greek word there. After he's walking along the path, moving towards Lazarus' tomb, and the Jews around him say, why couldn't he have healed him? And it says Jesus was deeply moved. The Greek there is a very powerful word that means anguish and maybe even outrage. And I think he was in anguish and outraged at what death does to us. And so I firmly believe that he accompanies us still when we feel those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Hebrews chapter 5, it talks about how in Jesus' lifetime, he prayed with loud cries to his Father, and he was heard. And that could refer to Gethsemane, but it's plural, so it's interesting. Jesus certainly lamented and grieved the things that were not the way he wanted them to be in this world. And so Hebrews says, so then we can go to this high priest for grace and mercy, knowing that he understands our grief and our loss. That's pretty powerful stuff.
So when someone comes to us with a loss, a grief, something they're sharing, we can affirm them in the fact that this is not how God intended us to live in this world with grief and loss. And rather than casting any shame on them, just affirm that feeling and point them to Jesus and say, yeah, we're, what you're feeling, you're feeling that things that are common with our own Savior.
Yes, that's so correct. If the Son of God felt so free to grieve and to cry out to his Father, then certainly he extends that to us. And I often take people to the Psalms, because at least 30 or 40% of the Psalms are laments. And if you read them, especially some of them, they are blatantly honest. How long, O Lord? Why do you let this happen? Why do you let me be in pain? And I love it because Eugene Peterson calls the Psalms us responding to God. God reached out to us first. And we respond back to God, and they teach us how very honest we can be with God.
I think it's really helpful from all the references you gave, and especially looking at the Psalms. God is not afraid of our emotions.
He is not.
And he gave us those emotions.
That's right.
And so I think if we learn to steward those emotions well and take, I think it's a part of taking care of ourselves. We talk about exercise and we talk about eating well and all these different things, that we're whole people. Taking care of our emotions well and grieving well is also part of health.
It is. Yeah. Developing a talk called managing emotions, because that's what we, like you say, Carol, we need to be stewards of these gifts really that God gave us. And we're created in his image. He's an emotional God. So what do we do? What do we do with them? And I think we pay attention to them, but we don't live by them.
Yes.
We don't let them dictate our behavior. That's for our will to do. But if we don't acknowledge them and listen to them, then we're in trouble. Then they go deep down and, and cause other problems. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a helpful distinction. We acknowledge them, we, in some sense, embrace them as being a part of who we are, but they don't dictate our behavior. Is,
Correct.
I think, a very helpful distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, if you were to give maybe someone some resources or books, are you aware of some good material out there that might interest a cross-cultural worker wanting to learn more about this?
Yeah, there are a lot of books on how to deal with loss of loved ones out there.
Mm-hmm.
But I like H. Norman Wright, Recovering from the Losses of Life, and that's an older book that's been around for quite a while, because he deals not only with loss of loved one by death, but other losses. And then there's another one called Life is Goodbye, Life is Hello, Grieving Well Through All Kinds of Loss by Ella Renee Bozarth, Bozarth. So those are two books.
That's helpful. We're always trying to find good resources for our listeners. I think they're definitely an interest in going deeper. Now we can kind of touch on some things, but there's still a lot to learn.
And in the book that I wrote called Sojourner's Workbook, and I think it's chapter 3, I deal with losses. And it's a workbook format, so it forces the person to kind of answer the questions, not just read the book and put it away, but kind of interact with, what do I feel is a loss? How do I do my grieving? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about Ascending Church, and they have a family that's about to leave to go to an overseas assignment, or a family that's coming back for a short term, or maybe long or permanently. Give them some tips on how to talk, that just what are the better things to say to the departing or arriving family, as opposed to just like, oh, it'll be fine, you'll be okay, it's not important, that kind of stuff.
If they could say to their missionary family, know that you are really going to miss some things. There are going to be some hard days. We would like you to know that if you write us about those days, we are not going to think that you're a failure. We're going to understand that there just are some hard times. Because truly, that is often a mixed bag for missionaries. If they write home too honestly, people get worried.
Yeah.
So if they know that they can write home, at least to a particular group of people, and know that that group of people is going to resonate, they're not going to completely understand because they're not there, but they're going to understand this was part of the cost anticipated ahead of time. And they're not going to question the spirituality of their missionary just because they're having a rough month.
So to follow up, I guess, a little bit, when should someone be worried about a missionary on the field? When has the grief kind of come to a point, perhaps that it hasn't been resolved, they're not getting help where they are? What kind of interventions would you look at?
Yeah, in a couple of different ways. A person who is actually quite irritable and angry and touchy, there might be loss that's underlying that. And they probably need some help maybe getting away from their current situation so that they can reflect with a counselor or with some time and figure out those losses. The other way that worries me is symptoms of depression, where the person has lost weight or gained weight. They seem perpetually sad. They're not sleeping well. They don't have energy to do things. They're not productive. And the people around them are worried. And if that goes on for 4 or 5 weeks and a little bit of rest doesn't fix that, then I'm concerned. Then that needs to be looked at.
That's helpful. Because I know people want to care for their missionaries, and I think that it's always a balancing act of, it's okay to grieve, it's okay to admit these feelings and these losses and give them permission for that and space for that. And also there's sometimes it's too burdensome and they need help.
Well, and it's complicated. And let's say you have this young family with two little kids and they've gone overseas and they're learning the language. And then, they got malaria and the electricity has been off in their house for a week. Of all these many causes, what is it that's pushed them over the edge? It takes some teasing out sometimes. If the electricity comes back on and they get over the malaria and they finally learn their way around and they're still maybe weepy, or just kind of dragging. I mean, I send them first for a physical checkup. Let's get real. Is there anything physical causing this? If not, then what are you missing? What are the losses? And then sometimes there's all the typical losses. And then you find out, a sister-in-law who's very dear to them is struggling with cancer back in the States. And that's just the straw that broke the camel's back. It's a whole bunch of losses and this one that is just really, to mix my metaphors, put the icing on the cake for them. So
yeah, it does take discernment, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Connie, this has been a great conversation today, and I hope that as people listen, they can listen with ears of understanding, and as they read emails or prayer letters from missionaries, that they can kind of even read between the lines. But if someone is serving as a cross-cultural worker, that they'll take the time to evaluate and ask themselves some questions about how they're feeling, or why did I react that way, or what was really behind that.
Good. I hope they will too. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, and we look forward to having you here with us at Care Connection in May.
Yes, me too. That'll be fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie.
So, Steve, that was such a great conversation with Connie. What did you take away from our conversation today?
Well, she had a lot of great things to say. And I think the interesting thing, one of the things that stood out to me, she talks about loss, but and she's like, it's not necessarily the loss of a family member or a friend, which are very, very significant. But she said, don't discount the small losses, the loss of a dream, a reputation, perhaps someone's couple's inability to have a child. I mean, there's so many things that are losses that we can just easily gloss over them.
Yeah, and the cross-cultural ones are so many.
Right.
Just to be honest about those.
Yeah. I can remember the experiences of not even being able to communicate like a 2-year-old. I mean, a 2-year-old had more words than I did. And it's like, and
loss of competence.
Yeah, very much a loss of competence. It's like, I just want to tell you what I'm thinking, and it's impossible.
Yeah.
And all these things are important. And I think really too, as parents are talking with their kids, to be careful not to minimize experiences that their kids are having.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed the conversation today. And Cara, what things stood out to you?
Yes. So I'm always so encouraged when just thinking about that permission to grieve. And as I shared in the conversation, I can't get over how powerful that is. And I just hope that people will give themselves permission, and that others will just really embrace that and recognize that it's not something to be ashamed of. Mm-hmm. Grief is a normal, natural, healthy part of life, and something that, I think she gave great biblical examples that Jesus grieved. Mm-hmm. We can grieve too.
Yeah. Well, it all in all, I think it's a conversation that people are really going to benefit from.
So thanks for joining us today. I hope you have some great takeaways too, and we look forward to next time.
Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.